When it comes to weapons in D&D, we have a plethora of options available. However, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapon looks and feels with our own imagination. I'd like to go through and examine the weapons of D&D to foster a deeper understanding of what they truly are. To start, let's examine a commonly overlooked weapon that holds a dear place in my heart: the short sword. Over the course of this video, we'll seek to answer: what is a short sword? How is it different from other weapons? And what can we do to make it better? What do you think of when you think of a short sword? Probably something like this: a basic sword with a crossguard, pommel, and a smaller handle for one-handed use. However, other definitions scattered about would say that a short sword would actually look similar to these. So, which of these is actually a short sword? How long can a sword be before it stops being a short sword? And how short can it be before it becomes a dagger? Well, the classification of swords isn't an exact science, but generally speaking, a short sword is a blade that has a 30 to 60 centimeter blade length, is wielded in one hand, and has a double-bladed edge, meaning both sides of the sword are sharpened for forehand and backhand swings. Due to the limitations of smithing in the ancient world, short swords were one of the most common bladed weapons of the time, with the Roman gladius being the most prevalent. Evolved from the design used by Hannibal's Celtiberian mercenaries during the First Punic War, it had a 45 to 60 centimeter double-edged iron or steel blade and weighed up to 1 kilogram. The shorter length and pointed tip meant that it was good at both slashing and stabbing while on foot, which gave infantry soldiers versatility in how they fought their foes on the battlefield. Due to its lack of reach, it was often paired with a large square shield, known as a scutum, to allow the soldier to get close to their enemy and strike. Outside of Europe, other types of short swords would include weapons like the Japanese wakizashi, the Indonesian lawuk, and the Indian khanda. As smithing techniques improved from the 3rd century onwards, longer blades could be made without sacrificing the durability of the metal, which pushed the short sword out of the spotlight in favor of long swords in early medieval history. This wasn't the end for the short sword though, as they remained in use as a backup or budget weapon. One such budget weapon was the seax, a crude weapon with a simple handle and an iron or steel blade measuring up to 50 centimeters in longer variants. While not as popular as the Roman spatha variants that turned into the traditional long swords we know and love today, seaxes were a common short sword that found quite a bit of use for European warriors of the early Middle Ages. It's from these long knives and gladii that the identity of the short sword, as we know it in tabletop gaming, takes shape. Across the various editions of D&D, the short sword is described as a martial weapon with a 30 to 55 centimeter blade, a weight around 1 kilogram, and a damage die of 1d6 piercing damage. Compared to the longsword or rapier's 1d8 or even 1d10 damage, the short sword's 1d6 looks pretty lackluster. The short sword's damage suffers from a common misconception that length directly correlates to lethality, something that unfortunately translates to daggers as well. Historically, short swords operated just as effectively as long swords when it came to chopping, slashing, and piercing. Their major flaw was that they didn't have as much reach as long swords, which made them less effective while mounted or without the pairing of an offhand shield to let the user get closer to their target. This difference in damage can also be attributed to game balance, however, sacrificing the realistic effectiveness of the weapon to provide the players of a game diversity in their equipment choices. While its damage may be lackluster, the maneuverability of the short sword is properly reflected in its weapon features, containing both the finesse and light weapon properties. The finesse property allows the user to add either their dexterity or strength when making attacks, giving dexterity-based classes a good martial weapon to use while not restricting it from strength-based classes. The light property allows the short sword to be used in two-weapon fighting, meaning that if an attack action is made with a light melee weapon held in one hand, the wielder can use their bonus action to attack with a different light melee weapon being held in the other hand. With its smaller size, lighter frame, and cheaper cost compared to other weapons in D&D, the short sword works fine as a sidearm or backup weapon for archer characters, but it thrives as an offhand weapon for dual-wielding martial classes. While it does have some uses currently in the game, the short sword lacks anything to make it unique. In fact, it shares almost all the same stats and weapon properties as the scimitar, with the only difference being that a scimitar does slashing damage and costs 25 gold pieces, while the short sword does piercing damage and costs 10 gold pieces. While the different damage types might be enough to warrant a wholly different weapon option, 5th edition is notorious for not having enough monsters with mundane resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities to have a weapon's damage type make a significant difference in actual gameplay. Plus, when a character has proficiency with all martial weapons, such as the Barbarian, Fighter, Paladin, and Ranger, there's no mechanical reason to choose a short sword as a single-handed weapon over more powerful options such as a longsword or rapier. And even dual-wielded, all a character has to do is take the aptly named dual-wielder feat, and they can drop their short swords in favor of war picks or other martial weapons with 1d8 damage dice. Now, 5th edition was meant to simplify everything, including weapon options. So many of the weapons from older editions were either removed or streamlined for newer audiences. But let's assume that we want more options for our weapons rather than less, because having more meaningful choices in our games is fun and exciting. So, what could we do to make the short sword a more meta option in D&D? I will note here that in the 1D&D playtest materials, Wizards of the Coast appears to be aware that the weapon options are kind of lacking, and are making changes to weapons that are similar to the ones we're talking about here. We're not going to discuss the changes they're proposing here, just because those changes are playtest material, and are subject to change. But in the future, 1D&D's release may use ideas similar to the ones we talk about in this video. Anyways, back to making the short sword more viable. The first idea I'll put forward would be to revert back to D&D 3.5's mechanic of having expanded critical hit options for certain weapons. With this option in place, a short sword could critically strike on a natural 19 or 20. This would keep the lower 1d6 damage of the short sword, but benefit classes that can take advantage of critical strikes, like the Rogue, Ranger, and Paladin, who can stack class abilities onto crits like Sneak Attack, Smite, and Hunter's Mark. The downside of this idea, though, is that it does mitigate the fighter's champion subclass, as that subclass's main draw is being able to critically strike on natural 19s. Another idea would be to allow the short sword user to choose whether they're dealing piercing or slashing damage, as Pathfinder's 2nd edition does. This could reflect the short sword's ability to slash or pierce depending on which type of attack is made, and against monsters that are either vulnerable, resistant, or immune to slashing or piercing, allows the user to swap their damage type on the fly to adapt to their enemies. As stated earlier though, the downside to this is that many monsters in 5th edition don't come with a lot of these resistances, vulnerabilities, or immunities. So, Dungeon Masters would also have to tweak existing monsters to make choosing your damage type actually matter in-game. The final idea I thought of would be implementing weapon reach more effectively within the game's mechanics and locations. Currently, there are no penalties to players using large or two-handed weapons while in tight areas. However, fighting in a constrained space such as a dungeon, cave or a narrow hallway would reasonably restrict a user's ability to swing larger weapons. By implementing a restriction on weapons with the two-handed or reach weapon properties, which could be something like disadvantage on attack rolls while within 5 feet of a wall or other obstacle, shorter weapons would become more viable depending on the situation the party was approaching. The obvious negative to this idea is that this is just making other weapons worse in order to make the short sword look better by comparison, and that takes away the fun of others who might want to use those larger weapons. So, while there are ways to try and fix the short sword in 5th edition, each of them comes with their own pros and cons. Overall, there just needs to be some other option added for players that may want to use the short sword but don't want to commit to dual wielding. It shouldn't take away the existing playstyle for players who like it, but instead add more playstyles to give people a choice through their equipment of how they can approach different situations. At the end of the day, these are just a few of my own ideas on how to make the short sword more viable. Even if left as is, the short sword is fine. Far from anyone's first choice compared to its counterparts, the short sword can still do its job relatively well. But when you're preparing your character, do you want to settle for fine? Or do you want to feel like your weapon choice matters? The short sword. A product of its time, it's since been living in the shadow of its longer brethren, even in modern gaming. But perhaps there can still be a place for it in the spotlight. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.